Great. Okay. Lastly, it's by no means least, it's Emma Phillip, who's speaking with Glenn Tyler as well, who's going to talk to us about the policy response.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. Right, I'm just going to have a chat about the policy response and what we've kind of been experiencing in Scotland over the last 4 months. It's been a very steep learning curve for all of us. What we've been witnessing, as it's been mentioned earlier on, an unprecedented event in our breeding seabirds. So yeah, just to cover what happened, what the response has been, some of the observations as well that you have been providing us, and also kind of looking ahead. Oops. Put the glasses back on. Okay, so this wasn't the first year we saw avian flu in our seabirds in Scotland. It was detected last summer, towards the end of the breeding season in Great Skua, up in St Kilda and the Fair Isle. And then obviously seabirds have gone away, and nothing really then until April 2022, earlier on this spring, when eider duck and great black-backed gull from Fair Isle and Shetland were tested positive. Then mid-May, we found great skuas also dead then in St Kilda and Fair Isle. So kind of a similar pattern to the year before, similar species and similar distribution as well. So by this stage, just in 2 species of seabirds, the great black-backed gull and great skua. Early May, we have more and more sites for great skua, and then starting to find it in gannet as well, so with gannet and great skua being found dead on Noss NNR up here. And then a week later, we were also finding dead birds on Hermanus NNR, and then over down on Handa, and some sites over in Orkney as well. And then within about 5 weeks of kind of knowing that there was an outbreak, by that stage we had it recorded in 3 seabird species, so great skua, gannet, and great black-backed gull. Then the 3rd week in May, things started to really ramp up, and we've got records from RSPB out at Troop Head of 85 dead gannets in their colony. And also starting to get reports around Orkney of smaller outbreaks in different types of species as well. So some gull species, also razorbill and guillemot as well, but in quite small numbers at those stage, you know, less than 10, so perhaps nothing out of the ordinary. So it's at this stage when we started to see it spreading to different colonies and to different species that a number of policy makers and Scottish Government, RSPB got together. It's like, well, whose role is it and who does what here with avian flu? So NatureScot, we're quite confident in our role. We have a role in conservation, we have a role in protected species monitoring, and we're also regulators, and we also manage some national nature reserves as well. Scottish Government, they have a wildlife management department that would deal with, say, for instance, when the outbreak happened in geese last year, banning on shooting, things like that. And then they have a disease and animal health department as well, and they manage the whole wild bird surveillance in Scotland, which assesses the risk and anticipated threats to domestic livestock. So that's nothing to do with wild bird. They don't assess the threat to wild birds. And then Marine Scotland as well, who have a role in seabird conservation. DEFRA, I'm sure many of you have come across the hotline or heard people talk about the hotline. So avian flu is a notifiable disease. So if you come across a single dead bird of prey, or 3 dead gulls or wildfowl, or 5 or more dead of any other species, then you're to report that to DEFRA, and there is a hotline there to do that. Over the course of what's been happening over the last 4 months, we've had different reports of people's views on that hotline. And it's probably worth mentioning that that hotline is manned by inexperienced staff. They're not seabird ecologists, they're not even disease specialists. They're people that are working and manning a hotline service. At the same time, we're getting calls about monkeypox, for instance. So it's worth bearing that in mind. In addition, also to know about the DEFRA hotline as well, they won't, as a result of phoning in and reporting a dead bird, that doesn't necessarily mean that that dead bird will be picked up and tested as well. Their surveillance is all around the domestic side of things, and once they've got a positive test, then that's an exclusion zone for 10 kilometres, and they don't need to test any other birds for the next 2 weeks as part of that 10 kilometres area. And then the other agency that's been absolutely crucial to all of this as well is the Animal, Plant and Health Agency as well, and they're the guys that carry out the testing for us. And there's 2 labs that do that in the UK. It's a notifiable disease, so there's only 2 labs that have the appropriate certification that can deal with a live virus. And there's a cost involved for testing as well, and that's anything between a couple of hundred to a couple of thousand per bird, depending on where that bird comes from. So by May, numbers of birds increasing, the numbers of dead birds increasing in colonies, over 1,000 gannets and 100 great skua at Hermanus now, over 100 gannet and great skua at Nos, over 200 great skua at Fula, 100 gannet now at Troop Head. Also starting to pick up dead great skua in sites over in the Outer Hebrides, which there were surveys as part of the MARPAN project last year, and no detection of any disease in those species, in those sites last year at all. We also got the first Arctic tern in Orkney and in Shetland, and they came back both to positive. And later on, we heard about reports in Guillemot and Kittiwake and gulls down at the Mull of Galloway down here somewhere. But still, by the end of May, it was up to four species. And it wasn't really until the 4th of June, and Maggie can correct me if that's the wrong date, but the first reports then started to come in from Bass Rock about dead gannets down here. So we really need to do something quickly to find out what was happening. And most of this information we gathered to now had been through social media, through WhatsApp groups and Twitter, and just picking up various bits of information that was telling us that, you know, there was something not right with more than just gannets and great skua. You know, getting Manx shearwater washed up on some beaches, it wasn't the only one. Was a bit odd. Very large numbers of guillemot as well being washed up on the east coast and also on the west coast as well. So NatureScot set up a mailbox which went active towards the beginning of June, I think, and we reached out to as many seabird contacts as we possibly could. So folk that really know their sites well, so we'll know for sure if there's something not right there. We didn't want to have every beach bird that reported into the website, into the mailbox, but we certainly wanted to know if anyone had any suspicious deaths within their colonies. And that meant that it was also very mixed data that we received. So we were receiving data of mortality counts. Sometimes it was whole colonies, sometimes it was partial colonies, sometimes we would get week by week information at certain colonies, and other colonies it's just a one snapshot event. We're also getting productivity counts as well. So, and again, some of those were sample sites too. So counts on adults on territories, for instance, with many of the great skua colonies. We pulled all that information together and produced a weekly update, which was distributed to Scottish Government, Marine Scotland Science, AFA, JNCC. You can read the rest of the folk on the list. And the aim for that really was to make it really clear to Scottish government particularly, but also ministers as well, because these were formed the basis of some of the briefings that we gave to ministers and to Chief Scientist Group, of the severity of what we were seeing, that this was something that was not just up in Shetland anymore, it was right down the east coast and in multiple species as well. We also reached, during this time, we also reached out to colleagues that were experiencing similar events in different countries as well, to try and learn from their experiences. So gannets in Fair Isles, Canada have been seeing gannet deaths as well, and colleagues down in South Africa as well. Michelle was talking earlier on about the 2018 outbreak. And I think Maggie will agree as well, once the news hit that Bass Rock gannets were being infected by avian flu, then there was a huge amount of media attention, and certainly in NatureScot we were probably dealing at some cases with about 4 or 5 in a single day, and that just takes a lot of time to prepare those media lines and to respond to them and to give interviews at the same time when you're dealing with an outbreak as ferocious as this, really. So June now, mortality is still going up. We're, as a result of the outbreak on Bass Rock, seeing hundreds of birds now washed up on the east coast, on the East Lothian coast and Fife coasts, sparking a lot of public concern, obviously, around dead birds on beaches. Within a week of it being reported on Bass Rock, gannets and guillemot now are being reported dead at St Abbs Head. And by the end of June, there's over 200 guillemots dead at St Abbs Head, and that's mostly chicks that have died there. The numbers of great skua are now over 700 at Fulla, and over 100 at St Kilda, and over 100 at Handa. And by mid-June, we also got the first records of outbreaks in Kittiwake, and we're finding 3 dead on the Isle of May. They later tested positive. End of June, we also heard of 2 dead bank shearwater found in the colony in Rum, one of those birds tested positive, so both were tested, and only one tested positive. But that was a real game changer for us, I think, because we previously had felt that maybe burrow nesting birds were going to escape this virus, but clearly that wasn't the case. So now, at the end of June, we're up to 7 species that have had positive results. So this did lead to very much a precautionary response, a very reactive, quick, rapid response from NatureScot and from other organisations as well. It was interesting earlier to hear discussions about carcass clearing. So that was one of the big confusions earlier on at the start, whether to clear carcasses or not, for the reasons we discussed earlier, but also for concerns around public health as well. NatureScot stayed with the Scottish Government guidelines, which is very clear: do not touch birds and do not remove them. And the reasons for that is basically, once the disease is there, the risk of further transmission is it's in the environment already. It's not going to make much difference basically if you move the carcass. But there are public health issues, and that's where Public Health Scotland come in, local authorities come in, and also SSPCA. Lots of reports of sick birds being, behaving oddly on beaches, and SSPCA had been inundated as well with calls out to euthanize birds. There's no option other than to do that for them. Pretty stressful time for all of their employees. The responsibility in Scotland for keeping beaches, public places clear of carcasses is the local authorities. So, like I said earlier, it's a notifiable disease, so carcasses have to be disposed of in a certain way. They have to go to a categorized incinerator. You can have exemptions for that to do things like burying on site. At this stage, because we manage nature reserves as well, we issued guidance to our NNR staff, both on carcass clearing, on appropriate PPE, biosecurity, and also risk assessments with some of the work that they carry out on a day-to-day basis. And it was this stage as well that NatureScot and BTO agreed on the suspension of ringing within Scotland. So what we were trying to do there was just to reduce any kind of disturbance, risk of transmission, any additional stress on birds. And this was mostly at that stage, 17th of June, focused around recreational ringing. We were still hoping that we would be able to provide some exemptions for research, long-term ringing projects that, you know, their information, their research is extremely valuable for informing other pressures that we have with seabirds. We had to do those exemptions on a case-by-case basis because the challenge was about being prescriptive. Being prescriptive, you couldn't really do that because the situation was changing on a week-by-week basis. It was spreading from colony to colony, to species. Every site was different. So we developed a kind of an exemption framework and used that as a framework for deciding which sites could, which projects could go forward. In the end, because of the way that the virus was escalating and moving on, we only considered exemptions for research where there was an additional HPAI research value to it. And that gave us that was a challenge as well for NatureScot, in that we're ecologists, we're conservationists, we're not virologists. So there was the whole virology around it and the science around virology is not something that we well understand. We did at that stage make contact with the Flu Map Consortium, which Emma spoke about a bit earlier on, just to also try and get a better idea of what their work program was and how some of the adaptations to current research that researchers were doing could fit into their kind of work program. Largely the response from ringing groups and researchers has all been really good and really positive. Many ringing groups had cancelled their annual trips out to some of these remote islands already, worried that they would be transmitting the disease themselves. Researchers had also reduced some of their more invasive kind of research as well, so just to keep it to the absolute crucial stuff that needs to happen. And that the men of NOS as well also decided way before any of this that they were not going to do their annual Cougar hunt on Sula Scare. We also closed, and it wasn't just because the transmission, it's not just researchers, it's not just ringers that are on some of these sites. Many of the NNRs are open to visitors. And so on the Isle of May and the NOS, because they're island sites, NatureScot decided to take the decision to close those sites to visitors and to reduce the risk of transmission spread by visitors. We started to get information out onto the website. There were already some really good ones out there. The Seabird Centre had lots of really good information. VTO also had some really good information on their websites. We also started to help APHA. So they were completely inundated with all the testing that they were having to do and really struggling to get birds in for testing. So most of these locations are really remote. They don't have any agency collectors at many of these areas, and the transport costing them was pretty prohibitive as well. So where we had staff or volunteers willing to help us, we provided swabs and carcass collecting for priority species that we considered that were a priority for testing from a conservation perspective. Later on, we also produced advice to site managers for all seabird islands. And that was following a consultation with some of the boat handlers, boat operators, Scottish Mountaineering Council and Ramblers. And that advice then kind of recommended that there were no landings on 23 seabird sites, and also to avoid walking in the Rumcoolins as a result of the Manx shearwater outbreak. And that caused significant financial loss to some operators. But again, a positive response, because you know the seabirds are important to them. That's their livelihood. They want to see them back next year. So July, yeah, numbers still increasing, over 1,000 gannet now, and 150 great skua on Hermanus. Over 700 gannet and 200 great skua on Nos, over 1,000 great skua on Fula. That's over 3% of the world population, world breeding population of great skua now, just on Fula alone. Over 1,000 gannet on Bass Rock, over 500 gannet on Troop Head, and just a single gannet remained at St Abbs by now. Just one bird sitting on the nest, sitting on with its chick. And also noticing lots of guillemots washed up on the west coast, well over 1,000 birds. We were obviously aware of what was happening down in England as well, with the tern colonies, both in Farnes, Croquette and Norfolk, but also similarly in Netherlands and Germany and USA. Tern colonies were being hit hard by avian flu. Interesting, no reports of high mortalities in any of the Scottish tern colonies. And that includes colonies where we knew avian flu to be present, so like at the Isle of May. I said earlier that the Manx shearwater tested positive. Yes, kittiwake was also found at Fowles Heugh as well, so Isle of May and Fowles Heugh now with over 100 kittiwakes at each of those colonies. We then, towards the end of July, got positive results in Sandwich Tern, Razorbill and Puffin, all in Scotland, and a high number of herring gull as well and great backpack gull. So now at the end of July, we're up to 11 species of seabirds in Scotland. So the response from policymakers, government, was to form a Scottish Avian Influenza AI task force, and that was really to draw on experience from across government, conservation organisations, local authorities and the research community to drive forward a collective response, because it's, you know, avian flu doesn't land in one administration's court. It's a number of different people that need to come together to make this work if we're going to provide a proper response plan to all of this. So maybe the task force mainly is made up of policymakers, petitioners, NGOs. NatureScot chairs that task force that meets every 2 weeks. It's had 3 meetings now, and it includes the Scottish Government Wildlife Team, Animal Health, Marine Scotland, local authorities, Environmental Health, Public Health Scotland, SSPCA, BTO, and RSPB. So everyone with a, you know, kind of practical output result that they can take forward. The task force will look at providing that collective response, but also coordinating monitoring and surveillance, and including an effective testing mechanism. I mentioned earlier that it's been a real challenge to get birds tested because they're not tested for, there isn't that testing regime for wild birds as such. It's to inform the domestic population, domestic wildlife population. And then they'll also look at establishing research and monitoring to understand better the kind of transition pathways and long-term impacts on the population, and whether there's any mitigation measures that we can start to think about to reduce the severity of future outbreaks and perhaps aid some of the discovery. And what I should say as well, the task force is wider than seabirds. So it includes geese. We're expecting those back anytime now, and also raptors. So that's the 3 kind of key groups at the moment that the task force is focusing on. There will be a stakeholder engagement element to this, and this week I'm hoping that there'll be the first e-bulletin that will be produced as a result of just letting wider audience know about what progress the task force is making. There's 2 subgroups that have been set up already, one on carcass clearing. So again, tackling that question that we mentioned earlier about when to do it, when not to do it, producing that guidance and being clear about you know, how and when. And then also another subgroup on wild bird sampling as well, to provide that kind of efficient testing network. Way over time on my map. Yeah, okay. And then there's also NatureScot has set up a scientific advisory committee to look specifically at avian flu. I won't read out the names, but some very distinguished experts in different fields. And this is really to bring those experts either in virology or seabird ecology or seabird monitoring together, so that we can start to address some of these really important questions that we've got about, you know, what the vectors are, what the transmission pathways are, what's the environmental persistence for the virus, and produce some modelling to help hopefully inform some of our policy and identifying those knowledge gaps in the future. So where we are just now, numbers are still going up, it's still happening. It seems that the press has gone a bit quiet in Scotland recently, but at Great Skua we've got over 1,400 great skuas dead on Fula, and that's over 4% now of the population, over 7,000 gannets on Bass Rock, large amounts of guillemot and razorbills fledglings. We have seen it in pufflings, in particular on Isle of May and some out at St Kilda as well. And a recent survey of Manxshire water colony on Run found 2 dead chicks. So my colleagues are up there tomorrow actually doing a last productivity count to see what's happening there. And also recent positive tests in Ida on Isle of May as well. So it's in our wintering waterfowl as well. So some observations. Great skua detected last year. Seemed to be that club sites were the epicenter for some of the early season deaths that we're seeing. Adults on territories are down from previous years. So in some sites we're seeing something up to like a 85% reduction in sites in great skuas on different sites. And some early results from APA as well. They carried out some post-mortems of 5 of the birds from Shetland. They all were females, but they showed an acute reproductive infertility with shedding of the virus through the oviducts. So it might not just be about what the mortality that we're seeing this year. It may have longer term implications for productivity as well. Gannet, that's just some observations about where we saw the kind of timeline that we saw with gannet coming down from Shetland on the east coast to Troop Head, then down to Bass Rock, St Abbs, and now down to Benton Cliffs. The picture's not so clear on the west. We knew about the early outbreak in St Kilda. We don't really know what the situation is at North Rona or Suez Scare or the Flannans. Suspect there is some mortality there. Also don't know what the situation is at Ailsa Craig at the moment too. But we do know that the gannet colony on Grasholm has been tested positive as well and experiencing large mortalities now. Other observations as well, mortality is not uniform throughout the colonies. There are individuals like the lone gannet on St Abbs there that are surviving this. Distribution, the drone image there on the far side is from the Seabird Centre collaboration work that they're doing with the University of Edinburgh. The yellow dots, you can just about make them up, as my colleague Glenn Tyler went through all of this and counted up dead and live birds. So the yellow dots are the live birds, the red dots are the dead birds. But what you'll also notice there is some really large areas where there's absence of birds, which should really be there. Some colonies have also been experiencing second waves, so certainly at Troop Head and Bass Rock, it seemed to die down and then it's all come back again. But adult birds have been noticing moving between abandoned nests or moving into abandoned nests as well. On Bass Rock, adults have been returning over the last kind of month. So numbers at the end of July are higher than they were at the end of June. And I think that's continuing to be the case. And then something that Maggie and the rest of the team on Bass Rock have noticed as well is this black eye syndrome that Matt was also talking about. So the gannet in the corner there, very black eye on the one side, and the bright green feces as well that, that Tom talked about. In terns, we haven't seen the more high mortalities that they've experienced in England and in other parts of Europe. We have had positive tests in Arctic tern and sandwich tern in Scotland. No positive tests in common tern yet. The red dots there on that map are just to show whether the big outbreaks have been in tern colonies. And then the orange dots there are tern colonies in Scotland that have had really high productivity success this year, and including on at Forvey there, we've pledged 17 little terns. Well, that should be terns, not tern, from 10 pairs of birds. So yeah, mixed picture with terns. Just some final observations. Sorry, Matt, I've gone way over. No mass mortalities in razorbills or puffins, and we haven't seen anything out of the norm in terms of mortality from Arctic skua, shag, fulmar, common tern or taisty. We don't know what the situation is in European storm petrel or Leach's petrel, and on North Sutor we know that cormorants suffered badly where they shared a stack with guillemots, but where they were nesting separately from guillemots, they actually managed to breed pretty well. No signs in red-throated diver or Arctic skua that share their breeding grounds with great skua. With large gull, the mortality seems to be more prevalent with the chicks. Over the last couple of weeks, we've had reports of great northern diver as well, 6 great northern diver on the east coast. Very unusual for this time of year, so we're just waiting to get those birds tested. And on rum, the potential for there being extra carcasses within the colony is giving us concerns about rats then being able to stay within the colony and feed within the colony over the winter and survive through to the summer. So there's knock-on impacts as well as what we're seeing just with the mortality. So what next? Talked about most of this already. So the task force is there. The paper that we'll produce as a part of this workshop will go to the task force and to the UK workshop in autumn. There's a global consortium that Michelle talked about and FluMap that Emma talked about. We need to analyse some of the data that we've received from 2022, and we're in the process of thinking through what a surveillance plan and a monitoring plan will look like for 2023 and beyond. Yeah, we need to be better informed for next year, really, and we want to be in a position where we are better informed and can balance that risk with what we also want out of research, for instance, through knowledge gain. And we also need to think about resourcing and funding. So yeah, just some thanks to a lot of people that have provided a huge amount of information, which particularly the folks that provided all the data. Without them, we wouldn't have been able to respond quite as quickly or got the momentum from people that can make decisions.